Have you ever been forgotten and feel like you don't matter? I know for many of us when we're kids, we feel like we're unseen or don't matter. Just we're in the way, right? It's very common. It's very common even as an adult to feel that same feeling. Do I really matter? Does God really care? Does he see me? What in the world is up with this God who's all loving, died on the cross for me? Well, today we begin our series, God Remembers You. In the study, we're looking at the book of Esther, a very interesting book, in my opinion, in the Old Testament, set in a time that it seemed as if God had forgotten his people. And we were going to see that in this very brief but engaging book, that God is always working, even if it seems like he's not. He's always in the background, even when it doesn't seem like things are going right. Now, today, we're going to be just laying the framework in this study and seeing how God hasn't forgotten you. We're going to really first begin by just establishing when was this book written and why is it so important and why is it that we find so much benefit for us today. And so begin, I'm just going to give you just a little bit of the foundation to kick this off, and then we'll introduce the topic of the theme, if you will. So the book of Esther has one really important piece that some people make a really big deal of. Some people just kind of skip over and act like it doesn't matter, right? It's the fact that the word God is never mentioned. There's no even really reference to God, just there in the background. It's very clear that there's a very importance to faith, and there's a really the Jewish faith versus the world going on here, but God himself is never mentioned. It just exemplifies the theme in that reality that God's never mentioned. It exemplifies. It seems as if God is absent. It's in difficult seasons where a lot of times that reality becomes even more powerful. And so the timeline, when was this written? Why is it so important that we emphasize that God seems to be irrelevant? All practicality. Well, it was written 483 years before Christ was born. Now, 483 BC doesn't really mean much to most of us, but to the Israelites, this was an incredibly important time. Now, when you read the Old Testament books, it almost seems as if like everything was just happening in sequence, like immediately, right? And so when we read the account of Ezra coming back with the people and then Nehemiah coming back, it seems almost like it was happening in exact timeline, like a linear thing. The reality was is that Ezra had returned from Babylon 30 years earlier. That's a long time. For most of us to be sitting for 30 years and not really seeing much of a move at all when that enemy, the Persian Empire, had released you from captivity to go back to your land, and now it's 30 years later, and all you have to account for is Solomon's temple being rebuilt. And as we'd read 40 years later, when Nehemiah comes back with his people from captivity to rebuild the walls around the city, the people come and the city still is in shambles. They look at the temple and they cry because that temple is really pathetic compared to what Solomon had built, and the gold and just the magnificence of the temple that Solomon built. And so we have this like 70-year period that Esther is just kind of plopped down in the middle of. And here we have what seems to be this timeline where it seems like, well, God, you let us go back to the land, but just like when we read about Egypt and them coming out of slavery in Egypt, it's kind of the same concept where they come back and nothing is what they had hoped. Seemed like God allowed them to be free just to live in misery. Now, the Persian Empire that we read about was magnificent. It was huge, right? We think of the Roman Empire as being big. This was an amazing empire that had conquered just massive amounts of land, going all the way up from Turkey down to Iraq and Iran, modern day Lebanon and Israel, and even parts of North Africa. Like this was Egypt gone berserk, right? Like a massive army, a massive land conquering. And this magnificent king. Now, this text calls him Asarius, but most historians know him as Xerxes. He was planning to even further his kingdom as this book was written into Greece. And it would end up being his demise, but he was just constantly looking to make this expansion continue to go forth. He was constantly conquering. He was so full of himself that it wasn't enough, that their empire was this magnificent land. He wanted more. And in part of his celebration, as he prepared to go out to war, he had 180 days of consecutive feasting for his officials. And at the end of that 180 days, as we read in the very first chapter of Esther, we see him having 7 full days of a city-wide feast. And he was so full of himself that nothing was off limits to how extravagant he would go. And so here we have, in the middle of this desolation for the Israelites, this powerful man full of himself, so egotistical, plopped right in the middle of the story. This book is about God's people, but the main person behind the scenes seems to be a king, an earthly king, an ungodly king. But yet, how he deals with the main character of the story, Esther, is beautiful. He's caring. He's loving. He gives her grace in a time where he didn't have to give it to her, especially considering the background that we'll read in chapter 1. So it's just a beautiful story of how God is moving, even in this evil king during a time of desolation. And seemingly like God is not working. He still was working. He was still in the background, connecting all the dots to this magnificent story of God's people. And so we get to chapter 1, and we don't have time to read both chapter 1 and chapter 2, so I will lay the groundwork of chapter 1 for you. I would highly encourage you over the next 4 weeks to just dig into this book and read it for yourself, make a devotional out of it, and just reflect every day about what's going on in the story and apply it to yourself and where you're at in your life. There's so much richness to it. And if you just spend time with God and reflect, I believe he will bring about some revelations, maybe even in your own life, that could be radical. And so, chapter 1, we read how King Xerxes is in this drunken state, right? At this 180 consecutive days with him and his officials, partying it up, right? And then 7 days of the citywide festival. And he summons his wife, Queen Vashti, to come out and to display her beauty. Right? Again, just remember, this guy was so full of himself. He was conceited. He had all the power. He had everybody at his feet. And he could say anything and do anything, and people would follow his rule. Well, he summons his wife. to come out and to display her beauty. We don't really know what that means, though historians can point to the fact that it would to kind of show off her beauty in a provocative way, but she refused. We don't know why. If you read the story, it's not very clear why she refused. Was it because she was despised by him behind the scenes? Was it because she didn't like his drunkenness and his parties and how they flaunted people without respect? We don't know again. But what we do know is that resulted in her being removed. She was kicked out. She was killed, banished, no longer the queen. And why was the reasoning? So he could simply show that women do not disrespect their husbands. He didn't want others to follow her example and disrespect the power that be in the household. He set a pretty big precedent if he would do that to his own beautiful queen. Well, fast forward 4 years, and after his failed attack on Greece, Xerxes came home and wanted a wife once again. And out of 400 women, one would stand out. An unknown person, a person not from Persia. In fact, he, as far as we're aware, didn't even know her nationality, but he chose her. He chose her to represent to the women the beauty and the power of his rule. So we jump into chapter 2, and we'll read the first 18 verses, and we'll continue through the rest of chapter 2 and into chapter 3 next week. So we read, sometime later, when King Ahasuerus' rage had cooled down, we're talking 4 years, it finally cooled down. He remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what was decided against her. The king's personal attendants suggested, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in each province of his kingdom, so that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem at the fortress of Susa. Put them under the supervision of Hegai, the king's eunuch, keeper of the women, and give them the required beauty treatments. Then the young woman who pleases the king will become queen instead of Vashti. This suggestion pleased the king, and he did accordingly. In the fortress of Susa, there was a Jewish man named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. He had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with other captives from King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon when he took King Jehoiakim of Judah into exile. Mordecai was the legal guardian of his cousin Hadassah, which is Esther, because she had no father or mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was extremely good looking. When her father and mother died, Mordecai had adopted her as his own daughter. When the king's command and edict became public knowledge, and when many young women were gathered at the fortress of Susa under Hegai's supervision, Esther was taken to the palace, into the supervision of Hegai, keeper of the women. The young woman pleased him and gained his favor. Notice she gained his favor. She was beautiful. Don't get me wrong, that was very clear, but there was something about her that gained his approval. It was attractive at first, but over time, something was happening that she just stood above the rest. Verse 9. The young one pleased him and gained his favor so that he accelerated the process of beauty treatments and the special diet that she received. He assigned 7 handpicked female servants to her from the palace, and transferred her and her servants to the harem's best quarters. Esther did not reveal her ethnicity or her family background because Mordecai had ordered her not to make them known. Every day, Mordecai took a walk in front of the harem's courtyard to learn how Esther was doing and to see what was happening to her. During the year before each young woman's return to go to King Ahasuerus, the harem regulations required her to receive beauty treatments with oil and myrrh for 6 months, and then with perfumes and cosmetics for another 6 months. This is crazy, right? I mean, just the beauty treatment lasted years. When the young woman would go to the king, she was given whatever she requested to take with her from the harem to the palace. She would go in the evening, and in the morning she would return to a second harem under the supervision of the king's eunuch Shashgaz, keeper of the concubines. She never went to the king again unless he desired her and summoned her by name. Esther was the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had adopted her as his own daughter. When her turn came to go to the king, she did not ask for anything except that Hegai, the king's eunuch, keeper of the women, suggested. Esther gained favor in the eyes of everyone who saw her. It's important. She was taken to King Ahasuerus in the palace in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women. She won more favor and approval from him than did any of the other virgins. Placed the royal crown on her head and made her queen in place of Vashti. The king held a great banquet for all of his officials and staff. It was Esther's banquet. He freed his provinces from tax payments and gave gifts worthy of the king's bounty. So here we have a woman from really nowhere with no parents in exile coming to the forefront. It's so clear to us today, but in that time, in such circumstances that were dire, right? Think of being caught up in a land that was just desolate, and you're in some foreign country because you were kicked out of yours, and so you look and you've been told what's happening in your land, and it's still not okay. There's still people that are trying to figure out how to just exist. You're in exile, foreign country, far away from God's presence. And now you get elevated right into the king's court as his queen. How profound. How beautiful. But just as you start thinking like this story is amazing, it takes a massive, massive turn with what appears to be absolutely no way out. But before we get there, we have this beautiful elevation of a person who was more than just beautiful on the outside. There was something inside of her, something that even Mordecai himself saw. He wanted to protect her. Each day he was in that court, going back and forth, pacing, waiting to hear how she was doing. Was she okay? Was she killed? Like, he doesn't know. He cared about her. He cared about her because I believe what was shining through it all was her demeanor and her faithfulness. It was who she was on the inside, what we read of that Proverbs 31 lady. It gained her favor with all the people around her, and most importantly, with God, who brought her and elevated her to the top when nobody else would have ever given her a chance. Yes, beauty is going to take you far, but God's favor elevates you to places just like Mary in the story of Jesus, taking a nobody and elevating her to be the mom of the Savior of the world. This is what happened with Esther. She came from nowhere. God saw her beauty. It's like what we read of in Psalm 75, 6 and 7. For exaltation comes neither from the east, nor from the west, nor from the south. But God is the judge. He puts down one and exalts another. Exactly what he was doing. He put down Vashti, though he wasn't responsible, right, for her being put down. He wasn't the one who caused Xerxes to get drunk and to have this massive feast. He used the choices of kings, the choices of a queen. He used them and created a path forward for what would eventually be the freedom of God's people. This is the whole story of Esther. How God is in the background, taking what people are meaning for evil and using it for his good, for turning it back to him. That is what the whole theme of Esther is all about. However, it still takes obedience, as we will see throughout this story. God wants to move. He will move. But there has to be somebody who says, like Mary said with Jesus, yes, I will be the servant. Yes, I will be obedient and be willing to be used by God. And we will see that with Esther herself. God could have used anybody. But at the base of it all, he uses those who say yes and will follow. So as we take this moment to kind of land the plane and to go into just a reflection and to walk away and to process this brief introduction into a beautiful story of God's redemption of his people, an ultimate redemption of all people, I want you to reflect on the greatest example of what it means to be redeemed, of what it cost God himself through Jesus Christ in the story of the crucifixion. If you've ever seen The Passion of the Christ, this movie depicts this so perfectly. Now, it is gruesome, don't get me wrong, and it leaves you kind of aghast at the end and almost like you want to just puke because it's just that graphic and that moving and that powerful and has so much elements of surprise and anxiety in it. But when you take a look at how that movie depicts the kind of ending of the life of Jesus, it brings about such a powerful picture of, of that evil that's going on in the background in the story, just like what we see in Esther. How in every one of those scenes as we lead up to the crucifixion, if you remember it or if you've seen it, and you can go on YouTube and just Google it, scenes with Satan in Passion of the Christ, and it's just eerie, but it's so revealing of what it is that's pushing this. That Ephesians, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers of darkness in the unseen world. It's very evident that the enemy is there thinking that he is winning, right? Like every step of the way in that story, in the crucifixion, that leading to Jesus' death, he's there and just eerie and moving in a way that's despicable. But if you remember the last scene, the scene where he is in the pit of destruction, screaming and in agony as Jesus doesn't just die, but conquers death. What Satan thought was his victory turns out to be God's greatest victory. The battle is over. Jesus wins, and the enemy loses. And in this story, we'll see that foreshadowing continually as the enemy continues to think that he is winning. And it's brought about very clearly in one particular character that we will come to in just a few weeks here. But he thinks he's winning. He thinks he's going to be elevated. He's going to be the hero of the story. And just like in the grand story of the cross, it turns on him. That's where it is in our lives as well. It may seem like the enemy's winning. He may feel like he is victorious, but in the background, God is working. God is moving, and he is turning all things for the good of us and his kingdom, bringing us closer to that reflection of who Jesus is in the glory of his presence. So today, as we close this time together, I want to just remind you that you are going to go through times where things don't look good. You feel beat up, discouraged, like you might as well not fight anymore. There's no hope. God will give you a way out. But here's what I know. It's not because you fight hard that you will win. It's not because you pull up your bootstraps and think, I got this. It's because no, you slow down. You step back. You spend some time with God. You reflect on what he's talking to you about. You read his word, and you get into his presence, and he will provide the way. It's not because you work harder and you try more. You look at different perspectives. No, it's you slow down. You hear from God. And then you need to be willing to obey. So that's my charge for you today. Slow down. Spend time with God. Hear what he's telling you and obey. Now, whether you're going through a time right now where you feel distant from God and like things just aren't going well and things are dark around you, maybe you haven't hit that yet in your life. Maybe it's just been all up and to the right, and oh man, remember those times because they are fuel for getting through those difficulties. But you will someday face those difficulties. Remember, in those times, God is with you. He is working. Slow down. Reconnect with him. Let him speak to you. And then through the strength that he gives you because you slow down and you've refueled your spirit with him, go forward with the power that he provides. Because those powers and those forces that are around you, God will, he will overthrow them because he is good. He is good. Father, I pray for every person listening today that as we go into this story of how beautiful you work behind the scenes and how you work through people who are willing to say yes, I pray for every person listening, whether they're going through a difficulty now or will someday, that you will give them the strength they need, that they will spend the time they need to be refreshed with you, that you will speak to them powerfully, that you will empower them like you promised you would to do the good that you call them to do. You don't ask us to do anything you don't give us the power and strength and wisdom to do. So remind them of that today in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks for joining us today. Next is Church Family Online, and we'll catch you next week when we flip that chapter from chapter 2 to chapter 3 and see the next steps in the story of a beautiful queen.